communism, socialism, capitalism. In most instances, communism and socialism is basically the collective ownership of the means of production, so state control of businesses. Socialism sometimes allows for businesses to be owned by other entities other than the government, whereas capitalism is basically you have individual ownership and corporations and things like that. With communism, you have state allocation of resources, whereas in capitalism, you let the free market decide. The problem with state allocation of resources is that basically the central planning might not always know what the people want, so then you may have a mismatch of what you're providing versus what people demand. That still happens in a free market allocation, but pretty much any company that's not providing the thing people want goes out of business, and then a business that does provide whatever it is that people want usually makes a lot more money and continues to do that. Communism, socialism, they usually reward party loyalty. Capitalism rewards innovation and results. Communism, if you think back to the USSR, there's a few countries now as well, but think of it this way. When people are copying the technology of other countries and they're urbanizing people that were in rural areas and they're going to now use machinery and things, they can vastly increase the amount of productivity they have. So basically, by copying other technology, they have a high initial growth phase. And at one point, they thought the USSR was actually going to become the dominant economy of the world and displace the United States at that point in time. And then in the 1980s, that just fell apart when the Soviet Union fell apart. So basically, you'll have a high initial growth phase. It'll stagnate because there's no real innovation, and we'll get to why in a second, and then it usually declines. Whereas in capitalism, being that you don't have this control of just moving all these people in to industrialize, it's more of a steady growth, but basically it's going to be a longer term growth, and that's as long as you're incentivizing disruptive innovation. And what do I mean by disruptive innovation? Say if you're a country and all of your oligarchs and ruling class own buggies and horses and things like that, and they want everybody to do that, they're not going to want to disrupt and destroy basically the horse industry. So they're not going to design something, whereas another country that doesn't care and they want to go faster on a road or something like that, they'll invent a car, and then the car can go faster, and then they'll invent a faster car and disrupt that car. Maybe they'll invent, flight or the internet or something else, and each of these will disrupt and destroy another industry. But in a free market society, it doesn't really matter because the thing that doesn't serve the people goes away, and something that the people want more is what they get. Why would there be a lack of motivation to innovate long run? Well, again, you would be throwing out some oligarchs or some ruling class, basically whatever it is, they're making their money, so they're not going to allow you to change that. Whereas with capitalism, you're going to have intellectual property rights, you're going to have innovations. When you make those new products, you're doing that for yourself, so you're willing to work those extra hours. You're not just working 30 or 40 hours, you might be working 80, 100, plus hours per week. But it's all worth it if you can make a vast fortune off of that idea. So that's going to help motivate those individuals, and they're not necessarily getting paid up front to do that, but they're willing to take those risks to innovate and get better and form those companies. Generally, in communism and socialism, at periods of time you'll have massive shortages. Generally, in capitalism, you'll have an overabundance and an oversupply of goods, and you'll have a lot more waste generally in capitalism, but that's to get to the market to try to produce something, and that's just generally what happens. I had a lot of friends that grew up in the USSR as well as other communist and socialist countries, and one of the things that they said was if you had enough money to buy a TV, it didn't matter because there were no TVs to buy. You would have to wait in like a waiting list effectively to get the TV. And you would only be allowed to buy a car if your manager would say and vouch that you were a good party loyalist and then you also had to have enough money to buy the car. Same with apartments and other things. And if people got married, they can get in a lot of trouble if they didn't just give away the apartment that one of the spouses was living in originally. And there were a lot of things that people would do to try to make money on the side, but most people got paid relatively the same. And that goes back to, why would there be shortages? Well, if I work really hard and the guy next to me barely works, we get paid almost the same. So why should I even bother to work or to produce more, even though I know I can produce more? And the other thing is, if this week I produce 10 items and next week I produce 11 items, my quota now for all weeks going forward will become 11 items, no longer 10 items, and I'll be punished if I make less. So I'm actually disincentivized to work harder or to produce more, because then that will become the quota I need to maintain forever. So I dare not do more work in a communist society, because if I do, I'll get penalized and I'll be forced to do that each and every week. Whereas in capitalism, if I get higher productivity, guess what? I can make more money. And especially as a business owner, the more I do, the more I make, the more I make, the more I can invest. I can invest in other people's ideas as well as my own ideas, and that's why the productivity is a bit higher, which then leads to abundance of goods. So if I just take, for example, the United States, we're not 100% capitalists. We're mostly a capitalist society, but we do have social programs such as food stamps and Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and things just as benefits to people. But at least you can have individual ownership of businesses and things like that. In other countries, even if you were to go to China, it's not fully communism, it's close to that, but they do have some other things in there as well. Taxes, there's a risk with high taxes, and I'll tell you that in a second. It's called, if we take a look at the Laffer Curve, the goal is to have the highest or the maximum tax revenue, and that's going to lie somewhere on a curve. This doesn't mean it's 50%, I just arbitrarily drew it here. Someplace on this curve is a maximum. If I were to take away 100% of everything above the average, and I took that money and I gave it to everybody that wasn't producing anything and brought them up to the average, and everybody made the same amount of money, basically we would all be equal in how much money we had. That sounds great in principle, but in practice what happens is, once the people make more than the average, they don't do any more work, because why would you? You go do something else, just hang out with your family. If you're making less than the average and you know you're going to always be brought up to the average, well, why even bother working, because you'll just be brought up to the average. So in all, then people just stop working, which then leads to shortages. Everybody gets the same thing, so why even work, or why even work harder? You have a decline overall in GDP. Now you may have massive runaway inflation, because people in that point, countries tend to just produce a lot of currency and give it to everybody, and then basically the currency becomes worthless because they're not actually supplying anything to a market or to other countries, and then nobody wants the currency. So you could do the same thing with taxes as you could with communism or socialism. So it's important not to go too high on overall taxes. You don't want to penalize those that are being productive. During the 1940s and the 1960s, that tax rate went up to over 90%. What they were seeing is that it disincentivized anybody that was at that top tax bracket from producing any more. These were the most productive people in the country, and we made them stop working. You were taking over 90% of everything that they earned above a certain dollar figure. So they figured, guess what, I'm not going to do any more work. And you don't want to incentivize people to not work by giving them too much. If you're looking to improve your financial education, please subscribe. I cover a lot of financial topics such as how to invest, how to make more money, and how to save, especially on taxes.